Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and this week I know you are all going to be just as excited as I am to have back on the show ritual abuse, human trafficking, and mind control survivor, mother, entrepreneur, tattoo cover-up extraordinaire, artist, gallery, and tattoo shop owner, upcoming podcast host of her own YouTube channel, and walking miracle, Carrie Olaje. Carrie was born into a multi-generational incest-based family from a young age and was sold into government and military-sanctioned mind control programs with the goal of making her a child assassin, sex slave, and ritual butcher, just to name a few of her jobs. Her abuse was perpetuated initially by her father, who then passed her on to other handlers who furthered her programming, trafficking, and abuse. If you missed her incredible testimony, it is a must-watch. Her story had a tremendous impact on me, and I was so thrilled to see how many of you commented in length how her story impacted you personally. We prefaced Carrie's last interview with a trigger warning because one of the things she did, which we haven't done on the show very much, was going into graphic detail about specific rituals she was used in, along with showing artwork she created to further explain the rituals. This was an extremely impactful way to explain something most of us listening cannot even begin to imagine or comprehend exists. We received so many amazing comments on that video on how many of you were able to understand on a deeper level programming and sorry, I just lost my thought. Hold on, I have to pause this. My screen just like blacked out. Hold on. Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and this week I know you are all going to be just as excited as I am to have back on the show ritual abuse, human trafficking, and mind control survivor, mother, entrepreneur, tattoo cover-up extraordinaire, artist, gallery, and tattoo shop owner, upcoming podcast host of her own YouTube channel, and walking miracle, Carrie Olaje. Carrie was born into a multi-generational incest-based family and from a young age was sold into government and military-sanctioned mind control programs with the goal of making her a child assassin, sex slave, and ritual butcher, just to name a few of her jobs. Her abuse was perpetuated initially by her father, who then passed her on to other owners and handlers who furthered her programming, trafficking, and ritual abuse. If you missed her incredible testimony, it is a must-watch. Her story had a tremendous impact on me, and I was so thrilled to see so many of you commenting in length how her story impacted you personally. We prefaced Carrie's last interview with a trigger warning because one of the things that we did, which we haven't done on the show much, was go into graphic detail about specific rituals she was used in, along with artwork she created for visuals to further explain the rituals. This was an extremely impactful way to explain something most of us listening cannot even begin to imagine or comprehend. We received so many comments on how many people were able to understand on a deeper level programming, and ritual abuse and human trafficking. I'm going to also preface this episode with a trigger warning as well, because this time around, Carrie will be doing an even deeper dive into programming, rituals, core splitting, dissociation, and so much more. Our hope is that this information furthers your deeper understanding on these topics, whether you are a survivor or an advocate. It means so much to me to see your support on this podcast. And I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone listening for uplifting, supporting, praying, and validating each guest who has the courage to get on this podcast to share their testimony. It just goes to show everyone has a story. Now on her healing journey, Carrie said it best when she stated the following, quote, "I feel like they've honed a sharp weapon and now it's pointed at them," unquote. A testament not only to how far she's come in her healing, but also to how powerful it is for a trauma survivor to take back their power and realize that the God-given gifts they were given, that their abusers tried to exploit, can be taken back and used in a very powerful way to change the world around them. Another quote of Carrie's, "If I saw my abuser on the street, it's him that would be scared of me." Wow. If you guys missed her incredible testimony, I'm going to link it below. Please go watch it. It was so powerful. Before I finish introducing our guest, I wanted to give a quick reminder that if you're a survivor, whistleblower who wants to share your story on the podcast, or who wants to share any information privately with me, you can now email me at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com. Please send me a brief intro of who you are and how I can support you. And all of my social media and donation links are also in the show notes. I'll have that all linked below for you guys. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming this week's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, fierce mama bear, walking miracle, anti-child abuse advocate, creative and artist, overcomer and survivor, the one, the only, Carrie Olaje. Carrie, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much, Emma. I couldn't believe I was here the first time. I really can't believe I'm here the second time. So thank you, thank you again for having this platform. It was huge for me in, my healing, just because it is very hard to find this kind of content, especially directly from survivors anywhere, except for like a few who have spoken out and written books. So being able to see the complete weight of all of our voices is something to me that has been incredibly healing and incredibly hopeful too, that we're going to create some sort of awareness. And that's the first step to solving this problem, of people that are, haven't had the chance to heal like me, even though I am very honest with people that I am still on my healing path, So I, as much as I am love coming on to really vocalize my experience and the experience of victims that haven't had a voice of the things that happened to them. It really, when it comes down to it, I just want people to understand that I'm not an expert. I am planning on giving some tips for sure on what helped me to heal, in my experience, and my views on what I experienced when it came to the trafficking and the rituals and stuff. But that's one thing I just want to let people know is not to find, not to see me as the only source of information, that you have a lot of, it's just because there's been a few people that did in comments, like you said, this is the first time that they had that other than this, all the support from the survivors, those were the ones that stuck out to me, and really hit my heart, so much, was just finding out, that there was a couple people that said that they hadn't believed in the existence of, I don't know, they didn't say specifically ritual abuse, child pornography, snuff pornography, mind control, I was going to say traumatization of kids to create essentially mind controlled slaves, all that stuff that was all part of my experience growing up. So that to me is a huge part of why it's so hard for survivors to come out. Is you really believe that there's going to be this attitude of disbelief, and your abusers tell you constantly that you're going to be disbelieved. So it's, and from a very young age when you're going to believe them 100%. So you know, to really like to come out and see so much support for me was incredibly healing. It's what I experienced, you know, before when I first came out about the incest, and I had trusted, you know, in God and my higher power just, you know, yeah, I trusted in God that that would be the case, you know, this time as well. And that really, even if it wasn't, that I just had to do it anyway, because it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. You know, so the comments, you know, that did say, you know, people had believed this is a real thing for the first time really was some of the things that was very motivating to me, because it's something, like I said, it's not just awareness for people who haven't gone through this. It's also awareness of this in like the public or the survivor community. If, especially if you're like, you know, earlier on in healing, having this knowledge that there's like an atmosphere of understanding, and not that you're immediately going to get called crazy, you know, for having really extreme experiences that are different from everyone else's, you know, that to me is like what makes it feel like we're, you know, when I look at a decade ago to now, like we're making some serious headway, you know, in being able to not just heal as survivors, but to try and heal like society as a whole, you know, and actually, you know, like I said, I constantly come back to the fact, you know, that, and that was a huge motivating factor for me, that there are kids still in the situation that I was in, you know, in the situations I'm going to, you know, go over more today, that are still there right now. Like, you know, it could be your kid, it could be your son or daughter. Basically, it could be, you know, it could be anyone really. And to know that, you know, they're not just going to be there for, you know, a week or something, you know, it's not like a 2 or 3 or 5 year jail sentence, you know, it's like, this is going to be like 18 years of their life unless they run away sooner, you know, like, or, you know, or maybe longer, you know, if you have the experience that me, that, you know, that handlers continued to essentially pick me up, access me, you know, in my training and stuff, and continue to abuse me even past, you know, the time that I was like a consenting adult, you know. But at that time, it really is, they're still calling up, you know, a part of your mind to take over that is essentially still a child, you know, it's still just like a traumatized child, and it's still just as easy to manipulate, you know. So you know, the memories that I have that are post 18 are the most difficult for sure, like not necessarily for any other fact that it's like the hardest for me to like forgive myself for understanding, you know, how, even knowing all the things that go into programming a kid to be, you know, what they made me, you know, as a child and then later on as an adult, you know, it's still very hard to still even like wrap my head around, you know, because it's like, it's the worst shit you can imagine, you know. And that is still some of the questions that we will address on, you know, the later Q&A that we'll do about like the questions that people submitted to you, that I would love to elaborate on, and everything that, you know, that's still one of the questions, you know, is snuff porn real? And that's one thing I have to say is like a definitive yes, it is. You know, some people, you know, in mind control situations, you know, where you're really going to have to traumatize a child like very thoroughly, like there is, and there's a lot of use of drugs and stuff, there is circumstances where they're going to simulate stuff, you know, like they're going to simulate killing, they're going to simulate injury, they're going to simulate a lot of different things that isn't real, you know. Usually in my experience, if that's the case, it's like it's intentionally part of like the manipulation, you know, because then like that person's suddenly gonna be alive again or something like that, you know. So it's there to essentially manipulate your perception of reality and question it as a kid. Or in my experience, just from I heard secondhand, you know, of cults and stuff like that that don't have the same level of power, you know, to where they would be able to get away with like, you know, accessing multiple children, you know, or babies or animals for sacrifice, and then, you know, being able to then dispose of bodies. Like that's like a whole chain, you know, big old chain of events essentially, you know, that has to take place. But, you know, using drugs, you can definitely create simulation that of things. So that people have, or so that kids especially, you know, have the experience, you know, LSD plus all the all the props, basically, you could create definitely the experience where a kid would question, did I hurt someone? Did I kill something? Did I not? For sure. So, but that's not really what we're going to be talking about today. So, that's for me, in my experience, that is still going to be a certain level of trauma that's going to have like a profound effect on a kid. So I'm really not minimizing that either, like really like, even just telling kids about horrible things and letting their own imaginations do the work, if like you're someone can really do the trick a lot of times. But when you have like circumstances like this, which is essentially you're trying to intentionally create not just a kid that's going to be abused by their own family, but it is going to be abused by multiple people, maybe used to blackmail people, or then later on like used in like more violent things. What you really need to happen is you need the real thing, basically. Like it has to be really founded on like the most extreme forms of child abuse ever, and that's one gap that I'm hoping that like my testimony will fill. That, to be honest, I'm not saying it's just me. There's plenty of survivors that have gone over basically the extremes of child abuse that occur. But it still feels like even with all those testimonies, that's still the gap that's in the community of people that are willing to look at this stuff and learn about it and everything. It still feels like that's where there's like this disconnect, is that there's still this like idea of dissociation and Manchurian Candidate stuff and beta sex kin stuff. It all has this very like Hollywood kind of appeal, like facade to it, basically, that makes it seem like like that. Still, I hear people say it's something that it could just they could just pick up an adult and do it too. And it's like, yeah, even if that's the case, like where someone had no mind control experience, and was picked up as an adult and went through really extreme experienced Stockholm syndrome, and is now like, kind of has like a different part of themselves that thinks completely differently about the world and is going to behave that way. Like the person's ability to do that is going to be based off of how much they were abused as a child anyway, like that's, and whether or not, it was the organization doing the traumatization early on, or just like the kid's early life experiences, like that's going to be the degree to which someone, can get essentially, turned into a slave. So this still, to me, this like idea, like I've mentioned before with like Split, where it's like, they don't like, the idea that there's going to be really drastic changes, and that, in my experience, then we didn't go even a little bit into like the amount of trauma that would have to be experienced for someone to have like that like level of presenting like D.I.D, which is like insanely rare. When I want to explain to people what the difference is, especially for a DDNOS system where the intention is that we're going to be a little less detectable, both by our own system, but then also by outsiders, the experience of a switch, or like if people wanted to see like a switch, like you could essentially look at like our bathroom rake mark in the first testimony, basically. So most people will see that it was probably a little bit easier to listen to the second half of the interview, than the first half. Mannerisms are a little bit different, but the thing is, they're not going to be drastically different to most people, to where if I hadn't pointed out right now, like most people wouldn't notice. They'd just be like, oh, like you were a little more nervous in the first one, or the first half, using, my filler words like, or like a lot more, basically giggling a lot more. A lot of that stuff, it's like, there's like a very specific part that was like created to interface with the public by my abusers, essentially. And that's, it's going to be very dissociated from any negative emotions. Everything is going to be a joke. Typically a little bit younger presenting and a little bit ditzier. So there's going to be lots of likes and and all that stuff. But like I said, I'm still going to have a little bit of that now, because I'm on a podcast talking. But there's a difference in the more grounded version of of me versus a more dissociated version of me, basically. And that's the thing, like my easiest way to describe it to people is that, I kind of described in the first one that we have the different, compartments that are sectioned off. But especially for like DDNOS, the experience a lot of times for me, I describe as a car. You have like someone who's in the driver's seat of the car, as in control of like the body and mouth, basically. And then you also are going to have someone in the passenger seat, and then maybe like 2 or 3 or 4 kids in the back seat, and everyone's, it's not like the driver is like an isolated, like, entity, basically. But usually you are pulling like a trailer, I would say, of like all the other parts that are in the subconscious that haven't been triggered for a while, that are a lot more like not accessed unless something in your reality kind of triggers it. But essentially that's a lot of times, people's experiences, a certain like blending of parts where you'll have like a part that's in the driver's seat. And in my experience, first half of the interview, it really sucks when that's the case, because it feels very much like you're on a roller coaster ride that you don't quite have like the ability to control, essentially. So that's part of why I took some time to get grounded, essentially after like the halfway mark ish, essentially, because it was something that I was aware was happening, and needed to kind of like put the brakes on. But essentially, that kind of subtle shift that you might have seen in my behavior, that's like the shift of like one part taking the driver's seat versus another. Usually the other part that was in the driver's seat will now be in the passenger seat, so you'll still have input, like like everyone loves a backseat driver, but but that's typically like a lot of times how it works. And for DDNOS, the reason they do it this way is that you essentially want to minimize like full switches, unless it's triggered by daily events, unless it's like it's triggered by your handler. Essentially, they don't want, if you're a kid that has all these sexual skills or all these violence skills or all this different stuff, you don't want that just like coming out in daily life. And there were plenty of ways that it did when I was a child, like come out like, little things that it was just very weird to people, that I was so sexual or so, phobic of different things, or, very dissociative, which was like, they always said I was, in la la land, basically, so I was always just kind of like, daydreaming and stuff. So, but that's how it, like I said, that's how it presents. It's not something like big, like I don't, change your clothes and then all of a sudden, like obviously different parts feel more comfortable in different like items of clothing, but generally we're going to dress for like the part that's going to be, interacting most of the day, because that's how they're going to be comfortable, so that's really just kind of like the I guess kind of how I wanted to go over, just kind of explaining, the experience of dissociation, for myself, and just to help people like to kind of see, how, even if they're helping survivors in their own lives, that it's, you shouldn't necessarily be expecting them to talk in baby voice, or something like that. Like that can definitely happen. But in general, you should pretty much assume that like all of the parts are always like always around and like always listening, and just be talking kind of like respectfully. And that goes for like us too as survivors. Sometimes the front person can have like, not the best attitude for parts that we're getting to know, so, and that's like normal to be like that sometimes with new people you're getting used to. If you're on the outside world, that's very much how it feels on the inside world too, sometimes. So yeah. But that was I mean, a really long-winded way of just being like, I am like insanely grateful that it seemed like me sharing like did exactly what I had hoped, that it did, it seemed to help clarify some things for people, as far as like, I don't even know, just to me, it's like, the landscape of like the organized version of child abuse and, mind control and pornography, and then also giving some context to things that might be like weird to people, like the New World Order type stuff or something, because like I said, I don't always chalk up a lot of reality to those things. A lot of times, like when it comes to both the rituals and when it comes to New World Order stuff or anything, I like recognize that these are kind of the belief systems that are naturally going to come out of psychopathy, basically. So yeah, I mean, the only event, that I had wanted to go into that I hadn't gotten to go into before, well, had chosen not to, basically, because it's still an event that I am processing myself. So it's sometimes hard to talk about. But I decided that it's something I wanted to talk about today, mainly because I think that it'll give a really, I don't know. It's basically the memory that I have of like the main kind of like torture event that was created to be like I don't know, essentially like the memories that all of the other parts would then be based off of. So most of my later programming events that I had all talked about on my original testimony, a lot of them would use things that would reference events that had happened in this initial like programming session. So I would say, with something like this, it's like there's definitely like a main part that deals with it, but there's also multiple parts, and that's very intentional from them, is that they're a lot of times with this stuff, they're going to create a different part around each trauma specifically, so that, then you could re-trigger that part with the same trauma, and essentially, kind of keep working with it, essentially, with as far as training and just gonna say, or having it just, come out to do whatever the job was that the handler was interested in. So I'm gonna grab a drink of water. Do you have any questions or input or anything before I like keep rambling on?
I just wanted to say, I can understand how people got a lot out of what you said, because you really do have a gift for explaining things that are really hard in a very simple way. Just like that car analogy that you used, that even for me, like furthered my understanding of that, because I never heard it worded that way. So it's another tool that I can add to say, oh, that makes sense to me. Like I've sat in all those seats in a car, and I know like how I feel in relation, like when you're the driver, you feel a certain way. When you're sitting passenger, like you almost have certain roles, like you're gonna tune the radio or turn the volume up, whatever it is. And then sitting in the back, so I just want to say that I love how you do that, because I think that really helps click things in people's minds where they say, oh, that makes sense. That's something that I've done or that I can imagine doing, where what she's explaining happened to her, I can't understand. I can't,
Yes.
my mind can't go there, but my mind can be in a car and I can picture how those different roles feel. And so it's like a way for people to relate to something that they've never experienced. So I wanted to comment on that, because I think you do that very beautifully. And I think that like that's a natural gift for you, is educating on hard things and like simplifying them. And I want to thank people too, like, oh my gosh, the outpouring of support
It's
was
been amazing.
incredible, because I just delete bullies. Like I don't put up with comments unless there's like a healthy dialogue going on where like you can see people improving the conversation and people can read
Oh, I
things.
don't mind a debate for sure. On
Yeah.
a part of me definitely like has no problem, having hard conversations, with people for sure, because I think that's like needed, so it's something that I've got like after a while I've gotten used to doing. But like you're saying, on a certain level, sometimes things are just not productive.
Right. They're just there to bully, and so like I don't tolerate that. So there was a couple people that I did, there was a couple comments that I deleted, but 99.9% of everybody, like some people were disclosing their stories. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I was so blown away with all the support, and I appreciate everybody who sent in questions, and we will get to those. Like Carrie said, we're going to do a little Q&A towards the end. One question though I did want to ask you, Carrie, before you get into what you were doing, because I've actually had this asked to me a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm.
Sent some resources or some interviews, but I have a feeling that there might be people that ask this after you were just talking about dissociation. Can different parts so each of them has different role in a sense, so they have different skills. Can they also have different maybe physical attributes? Like could one part maybe be left-handed, another one's right-handed? Could one identify as like having blonde hair, you know, or like some type of a different attribute, and then another one doesn't, obviously, you know? Are there like different ways that, or like eyesight's different with one part than another part, you know, better or worse? Can things like that differentiate between parts also, or does that stay mainly consistent?
So that's kind of a tough one. I will say that I have heard of things like that, like really drastic physiological differences, you know, that occur. But to me, that does tend to fall in the category of Hollywood for the most part. I have always just heard it in passing. You know, it's like people have mentioned it, but it's like have never said that that was their particular experience. But when it comes to skills, for sure. So, you know, like, so that's like, you know, like you learn to ride a bike, you know, or you learn like, you know, like if you were a chef, you learn like a certain like chopping skills or different things like that, you know, like, so if you were to put the knife in the hand of someone, you know, and be like, chop these carrots like the same way of a knife as the chef, you know, like their hand could be anatomically the same as the chef's hand, but because there's no like knowledge, you know, there's no like mind body awareness on how to achieve the thing, there's been no practice or anything like that, you know, you're not going to get the same results, you know. So it's more, in my experience, it's more like that. Like, so like there's like parts that are really great at like maybe, you know, that were made to be like sex kitten type stuff. If you were to ask them to cook, like you're just gonna get someone really cranky and something really burned, you know. Versus like I opened a restaurant that like I, you know, had like and then closed it, you know, within a year because timing was wrong. Like I was pregnant and I was doing all these other things too. So, but you know, I closed that with like 5 stars and stuff like that. So it's like I know how to cook, I know how to make a recipe and stuff. But like I said, it's like, you know, it's very particular, you know, like what, it's more that when one part switches in, it feels like what the body feels comfortable doing will be completely different, you know. So you could have, you know, a star athlete and then a total like, you know, artist book nerd, you know, but they're actually in the same body, you know, and it's more about how they use the body than the body physically changing, you know. So I think that's like the main way that, at least for me, like, you know, dealing with like the more soldier type memories and everything, like that was one way that for me was very validating, but also very, you know, just trippy, basically really like freaky to be like, you know, like I don't know how to hurt someone, you know, but then when you're dealing with these flashbacks coming up and you're dealing with that part, you know, like that part has a lot of training that I like wasn't aware of as like the front person until I started dealing with all the flashbacks around it, essentially. And then it will, in my experience, you know, with like some integration of the memories, it will bleed in, you know, to where like now it's like some of like the weapon skills have come back, you know, and like, and that's something you feel crazy. And then you like, you pick something up, you know, and then you're just like, okay, like, I guess I do know what I'm doing a little bit. And it freaks you out a little bit. And you're just like, okay, but that's, you know, it's validating on the same level as everything else is. And, you know, there's a lot of things that you can't explain until you have your flashbacks. And then it's like, okay, like, well, that makes sense now. So for me, like I, right now, like, you know, in this, you know, setting and everything, like knowing how to like, you know, how to fight someone with a knife, like not going to happen. But like, if someone were to run in at me, you know, trying to fuck me up, like, and the adrenaline kicks in, like that's for sure going to happen, you know, like as far as, because, and that has even in my experience been some of my experience essentially, like when I was in a dog fight, basically, and that I think I might have mentioned it last time, but it was a triggering event in just like in recent years. I think it happened maybe like 3-4 years ago. But it was, a dog that I was essentially, my dog, that was attacking another one of my dogs. And during the fight, it really was like the internal battle, essentially. I'm still dealing with the situation, but you are typically still having like, a very like insanely, regardless of how like traumatic whatever is going on out here, it's like the conversation usually is very like rational, basically. So essentially, my like main part of myself, essentially, who's trying to get one dog off of another dog, who's trying to find a non-lethal way to do this, because I love both of these dogs that are in the fight, but the part of me that had been trained essentially to handle a knife and had been, around like vicious dogs, or trained to be a vicious wolf or stuff like that, like when they see the same situation, they're like, this is a threat, we need to neutralize it. So it was like, it despite, wrestling on the ground, and I had to get stitches, like 10 stitches across my finger, because like right in the very beginning I had like tried to pry her off, and obviously that was a bad idea. I got like, my finger sliced open, but like I said, I like it's kind of sucks. Like I go into like, into take care of business, like robot mode, like when it comes to like high adrenaline situations, basically. So in that situation, that part of me was like, let's just go in, grab a butcher knife, and we'll just end it, like just grab one of the knives from the kitchen, it's like, and it was like the whole time I was trying to deal with the dog fight, but then I was also dealing with this internal battle, of a part of me that really just wanted to, to essentially grab the knife and use it how we essentially had been taught to use it. At that time, it was before I had most of my ritual abuse memories come back. So it was like a time when I still had a lot of like gaps in my life. It was incredibly triggering. And that's part of why like that whole event for me, as, just like a survivor, just dealing with all that stuff anyway, it would, it's going to be traumatic. It's your dogs. If you're a dog person, animal person, it's like they're your babies, So, and I feel bad because the one that did the attacking, she just had a screw loose in her head. We had talked to trainers and stuff like that, but she came from a line of like, it's the genetic side of things, that for certain things, not for pit bulls in general, but for her specifically, she had a line of fighting dogs, and you assume that's not going to matter, but it was a consistent problem with her, like despite everything, and I still loved her. She was my princess, but, so that's just an example, of how same body, you're going to have completely different ways that you want to handle the situation, and completely different like skills, too, because it's like the part of me that was in charge and handling this situation was trying to hold back, the more like psychopathic feeling part, like that part of me, like they don't have any understanding of each other's skills. They don't have any each other's emotions or anything. So for me, it's like a lot of people that have the experience of like persecutor parts, or like they call them in D.I.D, or like, parts that are modeled after abusers or seem like they're demonic or psychopathic or something. That was part of the trauma of the event for me, is just like, what is wrong with me that I was like, that I was thinking about killing my own dog, you know what I mean? Like, even regardless of the situation or anything, so it was like, it was dealing with like the trauma of the dog fight, but then it was also dealing, as a survivor, you end up having, until you have context for like these emotions, for these parts that feel the way they do, until you're able to work with them and heal them some. It's really hard because you don't have context for stuff, and it just ends up feeling like it becomes really easy to believe the things that the abusers have told you, which is that you're evil, that deep down you're just like them, that basically that there's, that you're you're just a piece of shit and a killer, and that's essentially what I had lived with my whole life, and having no context for it. Most people see me as I've always been a very sweet, hippie artist, bookworm kind of girl, very academically focused and stuff like that. So, the thought, my, main self in life of ever hurting anyone or anything is completely foreign, so long-winded answer for I don't have any specific experience of stuff like that. Most of the time, like if when you're saying, they'll definitely be identifying as different things though internally. So, and that'll have like a lot to do with what it'll feel like the physical characteristics are of the body, so if like it's a sex part, I'm going to feel a lot more confident essentially in my body, versus if it's like, a part that's like that was there to deal with trauma, or is a more like masculine or male part, if that part comes out, they're not going to feel super comfortable in like this little female body, and even like the sex parts when I was pregnant, like, oh my God, like that was hard not to have like to get like really contextualized for them, like the pregnancy thing, and couple of the parts like were like especially when it came to like the more front persona, one that's usually interacting with the public, that's the one that always had issues with like body dysmorphia, and eating disorder kind of stuff and everything. So like for her to see like, to look in the mirror and see like a pregnant body was really hard, and it was also really healing, because it was an opportunity to then work with like that part of myself, and really recognize like, why do we have these unrealistic expectations, and like it's a different kind of beauty and everything, and it was really healing. That's one thing that I really push people to looking at the hard stuff in their life and looking at the things that they haven't wanted to work on and heal, is because as it kind of feels worse until it gets better, for sure. But like when it gets better, it's so much better. You have like, for me to like be able to like walk around in a bathing suit, like the first time, like it was like maybe like 3-4 years into therapy, and it was like a water park. I was walking around in a bathing suit, and it was like the first time I hadn't like thought about how much my thighs were jiggling or something, and it was just like, wow, like this is so nice to just feel like comfortable in my own body, and not feeling like, like there was all these anxieties and dialogues going on, and just like, it was just crazy, and it wasn't something I had expected to happen. You're so used to living with stuff, the way it is, but it's, when you're dealing with trauma on this level, like if you're a survivor, like it really is like the fish in the water situation, like your whole experience of like how you craft your view of yourself, the world, everything has been so fucked from so early on that it takes a long time, like as Ed mentioned before, I'm 7 years into trauma therapy, it takes a while to get grounded, and there's always still going to be times where like you're really not, like, and you have to, and that you're just going to be kind of white knuckling it until you're through to like the calm period, but yeah.
Wow, that was a really great answer. I appreciate you answering that, because I think that can be confusing for people too, but in a way, even somebody who's not fragmented at all, like we have a personality that we take to work, and that's what we do for 8 hours.
People listen to music to get in the mood, like that kind of thing, like to kind of like trigger like to get themselves like amped up into like a certain, people do have the experience of like a work self, a friend self, a family self, like that kind of thing. And it takes the environments or things to kind of like trigger like you to be behaving, in that way.
Yes, 100%. Thank you. You said that better than I could.
No, sorry to interrupt.
No, that was perfect. Thank you for explaining that, because I was trying to wrap my brain around it, but I was thinking, gosh, like I have, there's things that I can't say or do like out at work or around certain people, but like if I'm just chilling at home and there's nobody around, like I'll be more open and more myself. And, we all have like these different personas in a sense that we, like you said, adapt to with our environment. So I think if people can internalize that about just themselves, and then try to put it in the context of like maybe just not being as conscious of it, or having it be a little just a different dynamic of, of switching that, it's really not that hard to think about it being something that we can internalize and conceptualize, like I think the way that you broke that down, it can help other people understand how it's possible that can happen if they're like, that sounds too crazy, like there's no way that our brains and our bodies can do that. Well, yeah, they can, and you did a really great job breaking that down. So I appreciate it.
Well, and it's like, take that and then add like a blackout drunk. Like if people have had experience with that, that's pretty much, like what you're going to have like with dissociation is that there's also going to be like a chemical and physical thing going on in here because of like, that's PTSD, it's like, it's different than a normal experience, it's not just a normal work day or normal family day, it's the splitting, like for it to happen, it requires something that's like so traumatic, basically, that it really does require, your brain to be like, okay, if I'm still going to be able to have, a self that interacts with family, interacts with school, interacts with like mom and dad, even though dad is nice sometimes and other times like horrible, that's why it's like, your brain essentially creates the blackout drunk, like during that, that moment of intense trauma to be like, oh shit, this is something that you're not going to be able to like mentally like live with, be able to remember, like spiritually, emotionally, like physically, because a lot of times we dissociate pain, so that was one thing that I missed, in that answer, is definitely different parts in my experience have different pain, so like that's a lot of times how I'll know like what parts are like triggered. They have a lot of body memories, so you'll deal with a lot of survivors have things like that they consider like more fibromyalgia or different stuff like that. But a lot of stuff I really think is, especially if you're a ritual abuse memory, a lot of it, I think like joint pain or different stuff like that is going to be like just the body memories of being raped or being like tied up, a lot of times like at like joints or stuff like that. So in my experience, like almost all my physical like pain, like health issues that I've had, like have all been for the most part like psychologically triggered, by different parts essentially. And a lot of that too is very intentional by the abusers to essentially like create like physical, like really painful physical and emotional barriers to accessing those emotions. They kind of have these they're trying to build into the system kind of like these backup systems, to where they're going to be using your own body, your own brain, your psychology, a lot of things against you, and they know that in a trauma memory, like you'll essentially be able to call back up a feeling of being tortured, essentially, and that's like what they'll intentionally program in you to anytime your mind starts wandering into, making a connection to something it's not supposed to, that's supposed to stay isolated in a way and in your subconscious, unless they want to have access to it, then you'll start experiencing, a lot of like physical symptoms. So like sometimes, people will have the experience of having a headache and then it suddenly going away, like as like the part switches, or different pain sensations, energy levels, like all that stuff, is like, it can be really drastic, like one moment to the next when like a switch happens, because like all of that is linked to the thing. But like, yeah, so it's like, it's more about the physiological experience, I think, though, for the survivor than anything that could be noticed by like an outsider too much, It's other for things like posture, mannerisms, different things like that will typically, that will definitely change.
Thank you so much. Like I said, you just have such a gift for explaining these hard things, and I'm sure people that are listening are like, just having these light bulbs come up in their heads. So I appreciate you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I mean, that's like where, like I said, the fish in the water situation, that's why I really appreciated you taking the questions from people. It's just because it's my whole life. It's really big. It has so many different facets to it, and understanding where it is I could fill in some gaps for people that's actually helpful, or like where I'm maybe not being as, explicit, because, you just hard to explain your own experience, in general. So, but yeah, so thank you. So sorry, I'm going to grab a drink of water real quick. And then, if you want, we don't need them quite yet. I would rather get into the event a little bit first, just because the photos might be a little bit triggering for myself as well. The main reason I want to include them, though, like with anything, is that like for one, it'll give some context to what journaling is. And that's the, like, when you're journaling and you're dealing with like the shit that like we are as ritual abuse, or like we're, trafficking survivors, there's going to be some really horrible, disgusting things in your memories, and the degree to which you're holding back those things in, or pushing them away in your journaling, typically is kind of the degree to which you're kind of preventing yourself from healing. Because we still have this idea, this very childlike idea, that like it's still happening, we can't do anything about it, we're in an unsafe situation, like all of that stuff, is part of it. So that's one thing I like to say, is that you just don't, like, you really don't hold back. And in my experience, like, that's why like these images, of victims that like I'm going to be showing, like, are essentially like, for me, like the worst parts of the memory, are, but that really for me is like what the thing is that's the most like healing when it comes to journaling, basically, because it's, that part of you, like, that's the thing that it's like fucking lived with for like decades, and felt like, like it's like a part of yourself, as a little kid, felt like they could never share, would never be understood, all this different stuff. Or that, like, for the rest of the parts that don't hold it, that it's like, why would we want to go back there? That's how it feels like in healing. But the thing I have to just keep telling people is that whether it's journaling, for me, it's always, whether it's writing or painting, it's always got to start with the worst parts, because they're going to be intrusive until you deal with them, in my experience. And you'll start dealing with a lot of like physical symptoms because of it. But also because like for me, that's part of the healing, is essentially like these are 3 victims who never had their story told, and if this is like the way that like I, can just, also not just tell my story, but tell theirs, and have people like really understand like how fucked up this stuff is, and like how necessary it is for us to like I don't know, like create, like, I really think that, I know people want names and stuff, but, really until we have like a level of awareness in society that they're, in my experience, I've tried approaching law enforcement and different things with like, not the greatest results, and lawyers, different stuff like that. I have some in my court, but still it's like, like there's not as much as you can really do. So like for me right now, like I really am confident that like awareness is what you're working on, with your podcast. And I really feel like in general, like with people that are just advocates that are willing to just like be open with people in their lives about like, knowing about this stuff or anything, like it really is like the thing that is going to create, some justice for the victim and everything. And then also like create like an attitude. We just need an attitude shift, and awareness in this like society in general, because I know that, as people find out about it, people are not cool with it, national security be damned. No one's okay with systematic child like rape and torture, like, so, and that's the thing that it really is, so,
Yeah.
so yeah, but yeah, unless you have anything else, I'll just kind of get into the kind of like a little bit of the context with that memory.
Absolutely. Yes. There was one more thing that I was going to say. I think going off what you were saying, where society kind of stops at a point, I think that's why these analogies, to relate it to something that people can physically feel, see, and just kind of use their proprioception and like representational systems to process. I feel like there's a point, even with like, the words human trafficking, like that's a broad term now. People are aware of it, where maybe 5-10 years ago, like nobody had really heard that term really. It's pretty mainstream now. But there's also a block even with those words where people dissociate the fact that it's happening in their communities. They just picture, oh, well, that just happens in, you know, these third world countries. That just happens here. And so there's a big disconnect with people realizing like how close to home it is. And I think part of that is people are really afraid to consider that. But that's why testimonies like yours are
like, do you even want it? Like, I mean, who wants to think about this kind of stuff for more than like a few seconds? Like, it really takes like, I think it takes like, that's why the awareness is like important, because it really takes like a level of awareness, like in general, for someone to finally be like, okay, I can't not think about this. And you know, it's like I've heard about it too many times, like, all right, I've got to like, you know, see like what's up with this or something, you know, that it's, you know, and an attitude though too, like of within society, you know, that you're not going to be called crazy by your friends for talking about something like this, you know, even just as like, you know, as just like an ally or something, because, you know, we're dealing, in my opinion, with like the redux of the satanic panic right now. And most people are referencing the satanic panic right now as if that was a thing then, when, you know, when you look into all the stuff that happened then, there was a lot of truth to a lot of things, you know, and a few people that had gotten falsely accused were very publicly, you know, sacrificed on the altar so that they could essentially make it seem like everyone was making things up, you know. But really, you know, that's how we got to this place of, you know, insurance companies like suing therapists out of treating dissociative people, you know, like in the satanic panic time, you know, and being the False Memory Syndrome Foundation coming out as essentially a PR campaign that was created by pedophiles, you know, to essentially say, you know, anyone who was being accused of this stuff was, you know, being falsely accused, and it was all therapists, you know. So, and the thing that's really sad is like, you know, they recently had a couple that was like released after being falsely accused after 15 years in Texas or something. And it's all shit, in my opinion, that's just there to kind of like rehash that narrative, basically, that anyone who thinks that ritual abuse is a thing, that occult style abuse is a thing, you know, like anyone who sees that stuff as like a thing is crazy, you know, and just like, you know, like you'll believe anything you hear on the internet. And it's like there's so much evidence for this stuff. You know, law enforcement has tons of evidence for this stuff. CIA leaked documents have tons of evidence for this stuff. FOIA documents have tons of, you know, but it's still, you know, for decades, you know, but I am confident, you know, that with a bigger understanding of the problem, people understand it more as what I'm hoping they understand, which is just organized crime. Like no one has any issue understanding like shit around organized crime, and it's literally, this is just the same thing, but it's like, but the goods are like create way more damage, you know, because we're not talking about drugs or guns or something like that. We're talking about, you know, like innocence essentially. So but yeah, on that note, so I guess like with this, like I'll kind of give like a little bit of context, like a little bit of a recap, I guess, on where it falls into like the general timeline of my story. If you know, hadn't watched my first testimony, I would recommend it. It's way too long, but there's a lot of stuff that I went through, and that's even, you know, that's the tiniest little, like, you know, that's tiniest little snippet of it, you know, that I could give to give like a good view of like what kind of like what the different abuses I went through really entailed throughout my life, and everything. But an event that I hadn't talked much about, I had mentioned, was like the core splitting event. And this is something that, you know, everything's gonna, you know, all of my programming kind of like references back to, basically. And it's gonna happen really early because of that, you know. And so for me, it was essentially like multiple times to have like multiple traumas combined. So I had mentioned before, you know, that I was a military kid. Both my parents were in the military. My mom is like a very sweet, but also she was very like abused and kind of like blind individual, like when I was growing up, basically. my dad is a sociopath, so he has zero empathy, but he's very good at looking very charming and accomplished and all those things. And they were both in the medical field in the military. So because of this, my mom left several times to do training, where my dad would be left with me essentially as like a single parent for like, sometimes several months on end. So this particular trauma for me, and that's what I call it, is I just call it core splitting event. This particular trauma, like for me, was timed with like a bunch of different things. So essentially the first time that she left, we had just moved to Texas. I had some initial my dad had always sexually abused me since an infant, but it wasn't more damaging things. So the first time that I had dealt with anything a little bit more invasive or damaging was at Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. And that was about a year or so before we moved to Texas. And I had mentioned in the last interview that Texas is where essentially like all hell broke loose, for me, because it was essentially feeling like I had been, and this is why we need the awareness, feeling like I had been kind of like plugged into an assembly line of child torture, basically. And that the whole experience, as fucked up as it was for myself, it's like the whole experience to me has a whole nother layer of fucked upness to like my adult self, to realize how like I was just one of so many kids that went through the same shit, essentially, and many kids that went through worse stuff, because as you'll see, they use some kids to make examples of them for other kids. So for me, it was essentially initially going to Texas. Shortly after we had moved there, my mom went on like her first trip, basically. And so it was dealing with the trauma of that first, like mom not being around. My dad was usually on like fairly good behavior if my mom was around, but as soon as she was gone, it's like I saw a completely different side of him. He just kind of like turned into a bachelor, was very neglectful, like really was not very interested in me, except for like maybe like the facade of playing to like initiate like sexual abuse or stuff like that. So he, like I had mentioned before, like his preferred form of abuse typically was to orally rape me while he was watching snuff films. And the snuff films were typically people being like burned or like injured in different ways, sometimes suffocated and stuff. So I did have some initial, trauma, for sure, like they're always interested if you're going to be used for mind control, and like always using the kids of sociopaths and pedophiles and stuff, because they really want a kid that's, that's split early, so so I would consider this event more like what they wanted to do as like their main trauma event, essentially, to kind of like really kind of like anchor in some like, very powerful, very afraid parts, of myself that would be easy to manipulate as, the abuse continued later on. So after several days of being, a couple of days with my dad, being, a different kind of version of dad, essentially, and dealing with like the trauma of my mom being gone, it was being taken to what was essentially like a children's hospital, like a wing of like it, it was a wing of a hospital that was like a children's ward, had lots of colorful things on like the walls and stuff, like remember being taken to kind of like a room where there was like, toys, and we could all play like as kids and stuff. It wasn't a big deal to me at the time. I was like a little apprehensive, like with my dad just kind of like leaving me there with people, but they like say a lot to reassure you, it feels like, and as a military kid at that point, I was so used to just, going to daycares or different stuff like that. So essentially, and the thing is, when you're dealing with these memories, they're going to be dealing with like a fragmentary nature to things to a degree. So there's going to be a little bit of skipping around, you know, where I don't necessarily know how I got from one place to another. And I think also a lot of that is intentional when you'll find what this particular memory was like. So essentially for me, it was, you know, it was playing with like 3 or 4 other kids in like a little room and everything. And it's starting to get late. And then essentially I don't remember anything other than anything after that in that location. But then it's essentially waking up in what would be like a black wire like dog kennel. And this is where it's hard to say too, is like that I have a lot of memories and locations like this, which, you know, would be like, I could say, you know, look very similar to like maybe like some like underground bunkers or like bases or storage units or something like that. But it's hard to say because you could also be dealing with a spot that's above ground that has the same kind of jail like quality to it, you know. So it's, you know, with me, with most of my programming, you know, more intense programming memories, you know, they're all in locations that are, you know, very similar to like underground or above ground. Like I said, I don't know, storage facilities, you know, they're all concrete, you know, concrete walls, ceiling, you know, lots of like, you know, doors and sometimes like hallways that are big enough for like a little like ATV GP type, you know, thing to like drive down basically. So it was essentially waking up in like a black wire kennel in a little bit larger room that looked like this. It was really dimly lit, you know, it just had a couple hanging lamps. It was really dirty. It smelled like of urine and, you know, and like feces and stuff like that. Like it was, you know, the whole experience for this one, like from start to finish, was like created to just kind of like assault you on like every level. I kind of say, you know, like your senses essentially, you know. So it's like, you know, the place was incredibly dirty, you know, including the cage that I was in, you know, like nothing was clean. You know, it was, you know, like, you know, waking up, being very groggy, having, seeing like there was like 6 other cages in addition to my own that also had kids. And some of them were the kids that I had recognized from the upstairs, basically from the, from the waiting room. But, you know, and it was just, you know, being, you know, we're talking about like 4-year-olds here, you know, is like, so it's like kind of conversing, you know, like kind of not, you know, a couple of them just crying, you know, and wanting their mom, you know, and then, you know, essentially having, you know, 2 men come in that, you know, were screaming at us, telling us that we were we'd been sold, you know, that we weren't going to see our parents again, that like we should get used to like being here, you know, and that, you know, if we like obeyed, they might consider like essentially letting us go. And they like, you know, you try and do like a little bit of like pleading, but you're pretty much told to you know, to shut up, you know, and everyone's like going to do that. We're talking about small children here, you know, everyone was scared shitless. And, you know, they essentially just pissed on us, you know, and then left. So it was just being left there, like, again, like not knowing when they were going to come back. But then they came back and then they essentially like pulled a girl on the end out of the cage essentially, and they said they had decided that they didn't eat her, and that, you know, that they just wanted us all to know that we were either useful or we were meat. That was a lot of times a term that was used like with like me, like when it came to like slaves that were like considered, you know, someone to be sacrificed or whatever, is they just called them meat, which was fucking horrible. But essentially, you know, they essentially proceeded to gang rape her, you know, for the 2 men to essentially like rape her. And then they ended up calling in another guy who had 2 dogs. And you can pull up the first image now, basically, but it was the guy with 2 dogs. They were German Shepherds. And essentially he just had them like like essentially tear apart the girl. And that's why I know like this stuff is like incredibly graphic and really fucked up, you know. But it's kind of like you were saying, it's like you hear child trafficking or you hear shit like this, like I'm talking about, you know, and it's really hard to like visualize, you know, how, you know, like really how fucked up this is, you know, not just for like, you know, the girl that went through it, obviously, you know, but also for like the kids that experienced it. And I feel like, you know, and this is why these memories are particularly hard for me, is like, you know, they very intentionally made sure to like to kill people in like essentially the most violent, you know, fucked up ways possible, you know. And that's like for me is like the thing that it's like for these people it's no different than like mopping their floors, you know, or like, you know, like going to the grocery store or something like that. Like the amount of guilt they feel when they allow, you know, some dogs to like rip up a screaming little girl in front of screaming little kids, you know, is completely inhuman. And that's the reason that like that I really do, you know, this is really hard, but is also really like, you know, is really healing for me too, because like I said, this is the thing that I have the hardest time with, is just knowing that she went through this and that no one ever knew, you know, what she went through, essentially, other than her abusers who don't give a fuck, you know. And that to me is something I really cannot live with, you know, is like, it's just fucked up, you know. And that's why, you know, and you can feel free to take it off the screen share now.
You want me to
But that's really
one or just take it off?
you want to just pull it down and we'll just pull it. Yeah, we don't need to leave them on. But we can just, you know, show people as the things come up. But yeah, so that's what I was saying. Like, and that's the thing too, is to realize that it's like, you know, the context of this is that, you know, they were using her death, you know, it was just like like an equation, you know, they were using her death just like it was almost like, you know, this, then that, you know, like these are the batch of kids we have to traumatize. And this is the thing we're going to do. You know, it's like, who knows? Is this a daily thing? Is this a weekly thing? You know, is this a monthly thing? Who the fuck knows? You know what I mean? Like, and that to me is like where it's like, that I keep saying awareness, but this is why, you know, is because it's like we're talking about very real, very fucked up things. And it's not an occasional thing, you know, like especially with what I saw, you know, it's like it's something that happens, you know, consistently, and it needs to not. So essentially for all of us, you know, it was, you know, being left then, you know, with her, you know, they called him off of her like before she had passed completely. And I think that was really intentional because they like, you know, they just left us there with her, you know, like until she had died and everything. And, you know, it was essentially, you know, being told, you know, to shut up because there were still kids obviously that were freaking out and everything. And then, you know, like everyone does because you're afraid, you know, and essentially like they came in and told essentially asked us, they told us if we would eat some of her that we could go, basically. And none of us, like all of us were just like couldn't even like, you know, I can't speak for the other kids, you know, but me it's like I felt like it couldn't even like understand the question, you know what I mean, the question, you know. So it was just like there was no volunteers, you know, except for one kid on the end essentially who like they, and I think too, like looking back on it, it's like this could even be like a plan, you know, because they're trying to, like that was my experience, a lot of times they would have kids that had gone through abuse that they would mix in with kids that hadn't to kind of role model, you know, the behavior that they're looking for, you know. So this kid, you know, was said he would do it, you know, like went over and like, you know, and like and this is why I think he was a plant, you know. It's like it wasn't timid, it was like he was a little animal or something like that, you know, like. And then they, you know, so then they like, you know, called him a good boy and stuff, you know, and he left the room essentially with them, you know, and it was being, you know, left there with her. And then that's for me is like where my recollection cuts out again and then comes back into essentially like where I stayed most of the rest of the experience. You know, this whole experience I think was maybe around 2 or 3 days, but it's really hard to say when it's this kind of stuff. Like it's like it feels like an eternity, you know. So it is just really hard to say. But essentially it was going from the large room to essentially, you know, like a cell, a small room that was, you know, pretty identical, you know, single hanging lamp. It was all concrete. It was very dirty. There were like, you know, like roaches and shit like running around and everything. You can go ahead and pull up the next image, you know. So, and then essentially this one, like this was probably like I mean, all the parts are like rough, you know, but this is probably like the roughest part of the memory for me, just because it really was just essentially being, I had been placed in a room in this, you know, this cell with another cage that was identical to my own, that was essentially had like a little rotting corpse in it. You know, it was a little dead kid. And they looked really emaciated, you know, like they had like they had starved to death, basically. You know, it was a little African American child. And it was just, you know, the smell of like rotting flesh in the room was overwhelming. And it was just dealing with like, you know, I've always been a very empathetic person, you know, so it's, you're dealing with all like the fear, you know, of yourself being in that position, you know, of being essentially like left in this cage in a room to die, you know. And that's just kind of what's constantly going on in your head, is like that fear. But then also you're going to have a lot of empathy, you know, because it was just feeling sad knowing that that had happened, you know, to that kid, you know. That for me was really difficult, you know, that it was just, you know, to be able to, you know, for hours on end, you know, to just contemplate, you know, how sad I was for that kid, how sad I was for myself and not understanding why I was in that position, you know. That it was just, you know, it was just really horrible. And essentially it would be me, you can go ahead and take it down now. It would just be me. Essentially, I would go back to that cell like every time, but essentially in between times, it would be like being pulled out to essentially be like raped in different ways. You know, it's like each time there was like a different kind of like theme to it. It would be being taken to like another room that was really similar, but a little bit bigger, that had like a metal table on it. And like it would be, you know, tied spread eagle essentially, and having like, you know, initially it was being raped by a machine. So you had this sensation being raped, but you couldn't see anything. So it was being told that it was like demons essentially, you know, and that, you know, like next time it was going to be worse and stuff. So then you go, you know, back to the cage after that shit, you know. And it's like, so it's the dealing with like the pain of that kind of stuff, you know, in addition, and I also had like, you know, the rape memory with my dad had not happened yet. So it's like, so this was also my first experience with actually being fully vaginally raped as well, you know, was you know, it'd always been like, you know, fingers before, you know, so something like more drastic. This was like the first time that had been the case, you know. You know, and then you go back to that room essentially, you know, and then you're like, they pull you out later, and then you're back in, you know, the rape room, I guess I'll call it, you know, which is essentially a spot, you know, and this time it's someone dressed as Lucifer, you know, basically a devil, you know, big horns and shit like that, you know, and they're the ones that's like raping you essentially. And then it's back into the cell essentially. And then there was like a third time essentially that I got pulled out. And this time was like, you know, the biggest like mind fuck is that, you know, you've had the other 2 times, you're really freaked out, you know, and who walks in but is Jesus basically. And so you think like, you know, obviously someone that looks like Jesus, like I love Jesus. I'm like, I know this is not, you know, this is like the shittiest fucking interpretation, you know, like facade of like this crap ever, you know. So it's essentially, you know, like someone who comes in as Jesus, it initially seems like they're there to like rescue you essentially, you know, and be listening. And so you start pouring your heart out to him about like all the shit that you've been going through, you know, and essentially he just responds by calling you a liar and telling you should be ashamed for being a bad girl and stuff, and then proceed to essentially like rape me with like a crucifix, like basically. And that's like a memory that I would have to deal with like a lot throughout my life when I was dealing with like whenever I was disclosing and stuff. A lot of times I would have to deal with like a body memory of essentially being sexually assaulted, you know, and that's what, you know, it would come back to, is essentially this incident, you know, where it's like, you know, you start talking, you know, and that part of you is still in that place and is still scared shitless and is like, no, like I have to do anything I can to like, you know, deter her from talking about this stuff, because it's, you know, it's like going to make us bad, it's going to make us a liar, all these things that they tell you, you know, essentially like that that's you, that's the bad one, you know, not that you're like a victim, you know, in the situation. It's always that you're complicit, it's your fault that you're going through this, or you want to be going through this. It's always that mind game, you know. So it was essentially being brought back, you know, to the cell again. And then there was a last time like where we got brought into like the big room and there was multiple kids there again, essentially. And for that one, I mean, this was just kind of like another trauma to like seal the deal, essentially. And you can pull up the next one. And that was just basically that they pulled, you know, it was always the illusion that it was that we were all on the same footing. But I really think that, you know, that they had some kids planted in these cages to create different illusions, you know, because like I said, from early on the last, the last interview, you know, they always made it really clear that there were throwaway slaves, and then there were, you know, there were ones that they were willing to invest some time and money and everything and effort into, basically. And that you always wanted to be that second group, because the first group is essentially not going to, you know, you're not going to enjoy your life very much. So for this one, they essentially told us, you know, that this kid had kind of failed, had proved that he wasn't going to be useful and stuff, and that they didn't need him anymore. So they ended up pulling him out essentially, and like one of them like lit like the corner of his shirt on fire, basically, and then like a couple of them had like things of lighter fluid. And they just, you know, once he started to freak out when he noticed he was on fire, they just doused him in lighter fluid, you know, and, you know, obviously he went up in flames and he, you know, was running around and screaming and stuff. And they told him to shut up and just kind of like, they just kind of like kicked him, like essentially. And he ended up like falling over onto the ground and just kind of like, I mean, just kind of curling up and dying, you know. And it was just like, you know, it's like at that point there wasn't any screaming or anything from any of us, you know, because at that point we knew like that, like there was the expectation, you know, was that we were going to be quiet, that we were going to behave, you know, like all that different shit, you know. But, you know, on the inside, like, I mean, it was, you know, I've always had a huge phobia of fire, you know, for sure. Like, but it's like, you know, on a certain level it's normal, you know, but on another level, you know, and you can go ahead and pull that off, you know, when you're done with it. But yeah, so I mean, so it was kind of the thing to really like seal the deal, that it's like that these people, you know, really have control like over your life 100%, you know, that they decide whether you live or die. And if you die, how you die, you know, because that's what, you know, it really showed you is like, in my opinion, you know, like, I mean, any way to go is going to be rough, you know, but really it's like the three ways that they showed, you know, just like being forgotten in a room and starving to death, or, you know, the burning or the dog, you know, it's some of the worst, it's some of the most like, you know, like painful, violent things that you could go with, you know, and it really like, you know, it really does like, you know, just seal the deal with you, you know, that like that you're, you know, and when you're so young that it's like, you know, that there are two versions of reality, you know, there's the version of reality that you grew up with, you know, and then there's this fucking hell essentially that exists, you know, too. And it feels like you can, you know, at any moment, like, you know, get plopped right back there, you know? And so essentially it was having the whole incident, and then it cuts out again, and then flashes back to being in the hospital bed, you know, for, you know, like a first day essentially being really groggy and tied down, and then just being up and like walking around, and it being some of the other kids, you know, that had been in the cages too. But it's like, but now it's like back to the pediatrician ward, where it's like everyone is super, like all the nurses and everyone super sweet and very, you know, it's the love bombing kind of stuff, you know, where it's like your reality just went from being like, I'm gonna like, you know, die in this hellhole, to now you're in like a place that's like immaculately clean, and like all the people are very nice and very attentive to your needs. And I mean, a lot of it too is, I'm sure, just because they're just really trying to like watch and see if they can elicit any, like, you know, if they're trying to see the level of dissociation, I'm sure, you know, from all that kind of stuff, because it's like, you know, they want to know, you know, that you're going to leave there and essentially not, you know, not talk about what just happened and everything, but and that, you know, that you are the level of dissociative that they're interested in. You know, if like if you're going to come out and start talking about that shit right away, then that, you know, that's not someone they're going to program, you know, because the only people they program are people that can keep secrets, you know. So that's, and involuntarily keep secrets, you know, by creating walls in their head, you know. So yeah, so basically, you know, it was, you know, being there and then having my dad, you know, come and pick me up, you know, and it did feel like a very surreal experience. You wonder, like, you know, sometimes you would have little memories of like what had happened, and it was like, was it a dream? Like maybe I was sick or something, you know, or like, you know, is there, it's you know, as an adult, you wouldn't know how to wrap your head around it, but especially as like a kid, you know, having no context, you know, for stuff. So it, you know, it was my dad picking me up, you know, and feeling like grateful to see him, you know, too, because it's like, you know, they seem nice, but I still had weird feelings there, you know, for obvious reasons. So like, I went back home with my dad, but my mom was still gonna be gone for like a long period of time. So, and this is one thing that Prince Springmeier mentions in his book, that a lot of times the core trauma, you know, it like they really need the caregiver to kind of like seal the deal with stuff, you know. So essentially, like it was just kind of another situation where I felt like I had been kind of rescued, you know, and was going to go someplace familiar where I understood stuff, you know, even if it was with my dad, who was like had just been starting to like binge drink and do all that stuff since my mom had left. But you know, what ended up happening is, you know, like we went home, my dad continued on the binge drinking and stuff, and within like not that first night, but the next night, like he essentially ended up raping me for the first time vaginally, like too. So it's like, it really is like, it feels like at that point, like there's no safe place as a kid, you know. It makes it very like, it's very easy to see that, like, you know, as fucked up as sexual abuse is, it's like the least fucked up of all the, like the least painful, at least, of all the other abuse. So it makes it very easy to train like a sex kitten or something at that point, you know, to be like, hey, like, you know, like this is like being a sex object is like the safest form of abuse, you know what I mean? It's the best way to be, you know, or something like, and that's how you can get like the crazy parts, you know, that they go off of, you know. So that's when it comes to like this memory, that's where like each of the events that I had talked about in or at least the early ones that I had talked about in the initial interview, you know, it's like they a lot of times would start off like creating a part, you know, or triggering a part with the same trauma that was around like the initial that initial event that, you know, was just like, you know, a very long trauma event essentially. So when they were trying to create the dog alter, the whatchamacallit, like the wolf altar, they made sure to like start that off with essentially showing like a kitten be ripped apart by a Rottweiler. And it's like, and that kind of like re-triggers like the same, you know, kind of trauma of like that initial event, you know, and essentially kind of just kind of gets you ready for more programming for that part, you know, to be out and conscious, for them to essentially then continue to like you know, instruct or train or do different things with, you know. So, and so with that one, you know, it really was about then them getting me to kill a kitten. So that, like I had mentioned, so that was the steps that they take, to essentially, take a kid that would not be violent even a little bit, but it's like when you have all this stuff of this initial memory, like in your subconscious, in the back of your mind, on a certain level, like the resistance from the parts of you that don't want to do that is only going to go so far, because there's a lived experience of other parts of this insane stuff, that really you can't talk out of, like the kitten's life over yours. At that point, like that part is 100% survival, so, and they're like, they don't see things, it's easy to start creating a psychopathic or wolf-like alter, out of something like a part of you that's already decided that there's no hope in the world and no use being a little girl or anything like that, so yeah, and that's the thing too with that, like, is that really, like, if you're going to be doing some kennel training with me later, is you have all these associations in my head too, where with the wolf alter, with the dog alter was just more of a sex alter. It was just for bestiality type films that were always in this kennel that was kind of like outside of like San Antonio, Texas area. But when it came to like those alters, like a huge part of their programming was that, like other dogs, you want to create the if you're kennel training. I've never actually really done it with dogs, I think probably because it would be too triggering for me, but it's like if you're kennel training a dog, like that basically, like you want them to associate their kennel as a safe place, as a like their den, their home, like it's like their little room or something. And that's very much what they do too with like the dog and the wolf training and stuff like that, is that they want you to like associate, they want you to associate the person who's your master as like the person who like you rely on for your food and all your affection, and then you have your kennel, as the place where you don't experience any abuse and you're excited to go back to, and for me, like, it's like it would be easy to see like how that, could be implanted in that kid, especially when you were comparing the two cages to each other, because there was one cage that's in just like the hospital, an immaculately clean place. It's stainless steel. It's like all shiny. There's no bad smells, there's a nice blanket in there. Like there's all this stuff, and then subconsciously you're also remembering that the cage could be a very different kind of cage, one that's like covered in fucking shit and roaches and stuff, and in a very horrible setting, with a lot of unknowns, when you have that, and then you create this like dog or like wolf alter, that then did like the violent stuff, for them it's very like, it's like, well, this is like heaven, because for them they don't have the context of having like a normal kid life, like they're always called out when they're traumatized, so for them it's like, well, this is awesome. I love just pleasing my master and doing this stuff, because this is the thing that makes me feel like the world is predictable and safe and everything. And then, you take a kid like that, and then you just multiple years, you keep pulling out that same part, you keep traumatizing them, and that's how you end up getting adults that are super soldiers and sleeper people, and people that, or end up being, survivors that are self-destructing in, like sex work and stuff like that. It's a lot of it. It's almost like the altars that we created for ourselves, like run rampant. And just because we don't understand like what the dynamic that we're kind of perpetuating within ourselves, So I'm going to follow up, the end of finalize this event, with this last image essentially, which is this is how I kind of recommend survivors do journaling. And I myself do journaling, is that I always try and make sure to like not just journal like what happened, but also what I wish would have happened. Essentially, that's like a lot of what we do in EMDR or different things, that it's like, as part of processing the memory, a lot of times I'll be dealing with like anger, working with like my punching bag and a baseball bat or something, or some target practice or something, and just like visualizing, like in the violent memories, like like having gone back in and like taken out the abusers and that and rescued the kids, as opposed to like having been forced to offend on another kid or something, you know. And it's all visualization, but it's very healing and empowering, you know, for us to really recognize that like that the event is over, and like now we can use some visualization to essentially like create some healing and peace. And for me, that is always going to be based on spirituality. Spirituality is always number one for the basis of everything. So for this particular like photo, it was just like it was oh yeah, you can show it briefly. You know, it was just like, so
the hunt.
Oh no, it was the last one. It should have been the last one after
Okay,
the
let me
first
bring
one.
that up real quick. Sorry.
No, it's totally fine.
This side. I think there was only 3 on that one.
Oh, maybe I forgot the last one. It's not a big deal. It's basically like a Mother Earth type woman that's like just kind of like cradling like a little child, basically. Lots of flowers around and stuff. So essentially like that's usually what I do to kind of like create some closure with the journaling and everything. Is I can't literally go back and save those kids. I can't literally go back and save myself. But if I can, you know, create some like mental peace, you know, especially for that part of like just giving them like some understanding of what they went through, and some like just like being like, you know, what would have been the ideal outcome in this situation, and like, you know, and just kind of reiterating that like that we're adult, like in an adult body now. We're not in the same position that we were as children, you know. And that for me is like is the biggest part, you know. Even for this kind of stuff, I constantly come back to, and people say, you know, freaks you out, of course, and people say, you know, like, you're so brave, it's so risky and all this shit, you know. Like, yes, it is. Like, I mean, my whole life, like the shit I went through was like really fucking risky, but at this point it feels like more risky to be quiet about stuff because I'm healing anyway than to not, you know. Because, you know, if at this point, you know, if some extreme level of harassment comes, like, I'm going to have a lot of people that are aware of why, you know. And that did serve me well the first time I came out about the incest, you know, just with my dad and uncle, you know, was because they, you know, they did. I wouldn't be surprised if the 2 comments or a few comments that you deleted were from my family, because that's the thing. That's what I've come to realize, is that, you know, that the pool of people that are not okay with me sharing this information, or are interested in calling me crazy, or saying I need attention, or, you know, all the things, or my dad tells people that his reasoning for all this is that he tells people that I was gang raped in college, and that just addled my brain, I guess. So now I decided to like accuse my dad and uncle, and then the whole other network of people, essentially, of like molesting me my whole childhood. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, you know. But I thought it was really interesting that he said gang raped in college, because I was like, wow, it's interesting that you know that I've been gang raped, you know, like, you know. And but that's the thing, they don't know as abusers, you know, how much you're remembering. They just are shitting themselves because you're remembering. You know, so they're going to do whatever they can to cover their tracks, you know. So I heard it all, you know, that I was like, you know, that I was crazy, and there's all this stuff, you know. But what I realized was that, you know, the bulk of everyone else, you know, especially people that really I saw a lot and their opinions mattered to me more in my life, like, we're all incredibly supportive, and a lot of people shared their own stories, you know, of experiencing similar things, and that was just so healing, you know. So it really, like, I mean, it really is like I anticipate getting some stuff, you know. Like, there's going to be some people that are, and plenty of people that are not happy that I'm speaking out, you know. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't do it, because I do have hope that, you know, at some point, you know, we're going to have enough awareness to actually, like, you know, actually do something about everything. So I was gonna, you know, grab some water. Do you have any like questions or anything about what I just kind of went over, or do you want to just get into like a few of the questions if we have time? What are you feeling?
Yeah, I was going to comment on what you were saying with the last image that we didn't show, with creating a positive outcome. I really like
Yes.
that too, because I think that guilt that you feel surviving something like that, and that helplessness and that shame of like carrying, that's such a heavy fucking weight,
Yeah.
for a child, an adult, anybody. Like, thank you for sharing that. I didn't thank you for that. That was absolutely horrific. And I'm so sorry that you went through that. And I'm so sorry for all the children that are going through that. And that is why it's important to talk about it. But I think creating that positive outcome, like, you didn't have a choice to experience any of that. You were forced to do it. And so that shame of how they make you feel like it's all your fault, and it's your guys' fault that all this stuff happens. Being able to look at it from an empathetic point of view and saying, if I were to be, the leader of that room with all those children in it, like, what would I have done with those children? And
Yeah.
maybe something beautiful from that, and to say, like, this is what I would do, like, the children would be playing, or they'd be happy, or this would be the outcome. I think that's like really powerful with like reclaiming your power back, because they do put those thoughts in your mind that you chose that outcome and that you had something to do with it, and it's your fault, and that's going to be you if you don't comply. So I
Yeah.
really love that tip, because I don't know if people would automatically think of doing that, even with journaling. But I think that that's really powerful, because it exercises your brain to have freedom of choice and to have free will
Yeah.
again, and to realize that, like, if you were the leader of that room, like, you would have not done what the leaders of the room at that time, whenever you were a child, did.
Mhm.
So I appreciate you sharing that, because that's extremely positive and an uplifting way to, view something so incredibly horrific.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I think that like I learned in EMDR, but I learned early on that I could use in journaling too, is that we try and we want to focus, especially for that it's like a little part of us that needs to get rescued, that's still been stuck in that situation, and really it's like the best way to heal to heal the quickest is just to kind of like be very open and without judgment, both to the hard shit that comes out, but also sometimes like the kind of like silly, comforting kid shit that comes out, as like, because you'll have times for sure where it feels like the thing you need to ground yourself feels very childlike and not rational, but in my experience, like you're really denying part of yourself when it comes to that. And that's a huge part of it, is like for kids is like our imaginations were like used against us, as a kid. So now it's like you're saying, giving that part a chance to be like, like we have the power to do to imagine anything now, and the thing for me too that I constantly come back to is like I had mentioned before, like with the retaliation type things, because it's like, even with like that part, it was always like the hardest to convince that to share stuff, just even with like my partner, my therapist, anything, because it does feel like so dangerous and everything. But when it comes down to it, like that little part, like really it can only like be kind of brought into the present essentially if like we like listen to all the needs, I guess, basically, like without any judgment or any restriction or anything like that. And sorry, I got off track, but sorry, when it came to using your imagination, for your stuff, like it's also about like changing the clothing of the part and everything. So in my experience, like the part will always be dressed in like what like that, either the role that part felt like they had to have, whether it was a non-human thing or something, or it'll just be like a little kid version of yourself that's still wearing the same clothes and everything. So a huge part of it for me is just, just asking that part of myself, like internally, and sometimes painting and journaling about it, like, what would you like to wear? And it's like sometimes it's princess dresses, and so depending on the part, it's like, but in my experience, like that's really the thing that creates some healing, is that you like, it's almost like parts of yourself you were never able to like express fully. And the more you can do that, the more you're going to feel empowered, the more you're going to realize that like most of what the abusers told you were like complete lies, and that, you are like expressing yourself isn't going to just get you ridicule. It isn't going to get you, you know, a slap in the face or something like that. It's going to get you, you know, a lot of support and understanding and everything. But yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought.
No, that was great. You didn't even, you know, that was a beautiful response. I just wanted you to know that, you know, it's learning, I think, positive outcomes, and just having different tools in somebody's toolbox can be so healing. And I love the artistic side of it, because I haven't talked about that, you know, that side of it, aside from just maybe handwriting, which is still really powerful. But I love the artistic side and the creativity that you bring to healing. I think some people will relate to, and maybe they haven't heard that as much. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just remembered like what the track I was going on, because this is, I think, helpful for some people. So like we said, imagining like positive outcome for sure. But sometimes also the other thing for me is to essentially deal with my anxiety by gaming out the worst case scenario, especially for the kid parts. Because a lot of times, like, what they think is the worst case scenario is like not real, essentially, you know, like, or can't exist or something like that, you know. So for example, you know, for this part, who I had mentioned had, you know, was really scared about like me sharing, you know, with anyone, or getting in like way of therapy, or creating a lot of body pain or different stuff. Like you know, I at a certain point had to be like, you know, like the worst fear for that part is going back to that place, literally, you know. And it was kind of like really like, you know, getting like it's like an adult talking to a child, you know, to be like, you know, like, we have an adult body now. I have like a completely different understanding of spirituality, of the fact that all things are temporary, you know. And like, and I can't say that I'm not going to go in some horribly, you know, violent way, you know what I mean? There's people getting car accidents every day. You know, I just lost a friend a couple weeks ago in a car accident suddenly, you know. So the thing is, we don't know, you know, death is part of life, and we know we're all going to go somehow. And that's kind of like where I come to it with that part, is like, even if like worst case scenario, I got picked up tomorrow and thrown back into that spot, and it was like the worst case thing, you know, we were in that cage and gonna be fucking left in a room for like till we died, you know, or something like that. Like, I don't know how to describe the level to which that doesn't have the same level of fear for me anymore. Because the thing is, I have been a practicing Buddhist for many years prior to like coming back to Jesus, you know, recently in like the past like year and stuff. But I still practice a lot of meditation. I still practice a lot of stuff in my mind. And I know from Buddhism that, you know, we're going to go through a lot of fucked up things in life that we don't have any control over, you know. And even something that fucked up is temporary, you know. And there's not going to be the same level of like fear, essentially, at least for myself, you know, that there was before, because I'm going to understand that that's the case too. I'm an adult now, you know. Like, so it's kind of like really showing that kid that like, okay, worst case scenario, like the worst thing in the world happens, like we're still going to be able to handle it, you know, because ultimately we're not in the same place that we were before, you know. And that's the thing that I constantly come back to with people, is like, a lot of times that's what holds them back from journaling or doing different stuff, is they feel like it's gonna, once they get it on if they're getting out of here and out here, you know, even if it's just putting it on words on a page, that somehow it's going to make it more real. It's going to bring you right back there. It's going to make you feel, the thing is, you're never going to feel as helpless as you did then. And that's the thing, like, that's why I encourage people to do the journaling, because you'll think what's going to happen is you're going to put the shit on page and it's going to make it more real and more overwhelming, but it's always the opposite that happens. It's like, for some reason, just bringing that into your reality, it just takes all the intensity down. It connects the right and left side of your brain, the emotional and like the physical, brings you into the present and allows that part to be like, oh, like I put this on page and nothing happened. You know? Not like nothing happened. Like it's like the world didn't cave in on me. I didn't like explode of like shame or grief or, you know, like anger or something like that. You know, if anything, it just keeps, you know, it just like, oh, I feel a little bit better, you know, like, and so, but it's still something I go through, you know, is that resistance, you know, for journaling and stuff. But it is like, you know, this is pretty much like my journaling tips part, you know, that I had wanted to get to, you know, which is just that, you know, don't hold back when it comes to the bad shit, the good shit. Like, you really, if you are a survivor, that's like, you know, and even if not, to be honest, like I feel like people could benefit from this kind of work, even if they're just dealing with like you know, childhood bullying or different types of trauma like that aren't necessarily as like, okay, like I need to get completely in touch with the completely dissociated part of myself, you know, that's like freaking out and triggered and everything. It really goes a long way to us like exploring, you know, our minds and our motivations and our behaviors and everything. And a lot of times like the things that we do that are fucked up in our life like just comes from like a lack of like understanding, I think, and awareness of like why we're behaving a certain way, you know. So, and it's a lot of times it's stupid shit from our childhood, and when you can realize that, it's like, damn, I don't, why am I still living this way?
Right, right. That's so helpful. I love that you shared that. And I know that's going to be helpful. And I mean, stuff like that can be helpful, even if you haven't gone through the types of traumas that you have, you know, even if it's just, and I don't want to say just, all trauma is relative to the person. So I'm not trying to discount trauma, but what I'm saying is you don't have to go through satanic ritual abuse to find value in what, you know, the advice that Carrie's given. I think that all of this, you know, all of us have trauma on some level, and figuring out how to navigate that and to get it out of our body and how to express it. There's so many different ways that we can do that, you know, and I think like anybody can benefit from picking up a pen or some markers or some paint and some paper or canvas and just getting whatever it is that's stuck in us out, you know. So I love that you offer that, and that there's so many different ways that we can use that creatively to our advantage in our healing journeys.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope it makes sense to people. I feel like sometimes that I maybe have too many metaphors, or I'm just like all over the place. So if it's like, and it all comes from just like me, you know, trying to break it down for myself, or a lot of times trying to break it down for other parts. Because the thing is like, you know, like, oh, to try and get like all my parts on board for journaling, or all of them on board for therapy or different stuff like that, like is, you know, sometimes a challenge, you know, because they're like, until you have a level of integration to where like everyone knows they're on the same team like they are now for me, like they're, you know, leading up to that point, you know, there was still, you know, it's like herding cats, you know. And so you have to, like, in my experience, in my a lot of my benefit in therapy and different stuff is I had to learn how to explain things to my kid parts, you know, that were scared. I had to learn how to explain things to my persecutor parts, you know, who are really just bullies because they were also scared, you know. But really it's like, so like journaling, for example, like that's usually the main parts people want to avoid talking to, is because they sound like they're abusers, or they sound like, you know, a demon, or all kinds of things, you know, that they were essentially created to sound like, you know, to help, you know, help maintain the system order essentially in favor of the abusers. So really like you have to, like, in my experience, that's like where the most benefit comes from in journaling too. It's the most resistance, but it's also the most benefit, because most of the time you just have to, my experience, I just recommend asking questions, you know, like oh, like if they're insulting you or they're saying things have to be a certain way that isn't healthy, to just be like, why? Like, why is that the case? Why is that what you think, you know? And what a lot of times what you'll end up finding, you know, is persecutor parts are essentially bullying the system, you know, creating a lot of self-destructive habits or something, because it's like we talked about my early memory. It's going to be a very traumatized part of you that feels like, oh, like I need you to be a certain way, essentially, to protect the body, you know, to protect the core of yourself that we're trying to keep dissociated, you know, from all this crazy shit. Like you have to like subconsciously, we know what the abusers want, even if the front person in daily life doesn't. So there's always going to be this subconscious control in the background where they're trying to do things. But as adults, it ends up coming out in very self-destructive ways, and addiction, and, you know, just really bad self-talk, all kinds of stuff. And it really does take like, you know, in my experience, that's also the main thing to like move therapy forward, is like where you feel like you have resistance, you have to take time to create understanding and like coming onto like an even footing, just like you would with like any relationship. You know, if you guys are both yelling at each other and coming from two different places, then it's like you're never going to get anywhere. So there has to be, you know, and the thing is, as a front person, we're the adult, we're the ones that have spent the most time, you know, in present life. So it's always our responsibility to like not feed into like the crazy bullying or like all the crazy stuff, you know, and to try our hardest to like investigate it and create some understanding. Because in my experience, those parts are also parts that tend to have the most strength and create, you know, the most like almost stability within the system once they are healed, you know.
Yes, 100%. That makes such sense. And again, I love your metaphors because it just brings so much clarity to some things that are very unfamiliar to, what we learn. Obviously, we're not taught this, but also what we personally experience. A lot of us, we don't go through that. So it can be very hard for people who haven't to just even comprehend what that's like. And you do such a great job breaking it down. And I thought while we're on this topic, I know some people had questions about healing that
Yeah.
sentence. So if you don't mind, I'd love to piggyback off of that. I thought a really great question was, did you have any booby traps or biggest obstacles, I should say, in your programming? And like, how do you overcome that if faced with an obstacle?
It's always going to be about internal investigation. And yes, like I have always experienced a lot of booby traps, like they're like a core, like this core memory created a very strong urge for suicide, basically, because, you don't have any context for there being any way out of that situation other than to die. And you don't really know as a 4-year-old what that means, really like much other than what you're witnessing and different stuff, but it's just like it's like this abstract end to things. So essentially, they build a lot of, like, for me, like a lot of like suicide programming off of that kind of stuff, where essentially like it's like it will call up that memory, but a lot of times, like with this, like the booby traps, in my experience, they're almost like disembodied, like physical symptoms and stuff. Like you'll typically feel really strong physical symptoms, but the parts, because they're so traumatized, are usually like very not interested in interacting and are very like resistant to healing and very afraid, because they're very like core type memories, so yeah, so I would say like booby traps, essentially, like not to give them too much like power, essentially. Like sometimes when we think about programming or booby traps or stuff, it almost creates this idea that there's like something foreign that was like put into us that we have no control over. And there is a lot of manipulation to create what's going on in our heads, and to convince parts of ourselves that they need to do what the abusers want. But ultimately it's all just yourself. It's all just manipulation of a kid that's gotten you to believe something. So sometimes when we think about like booby traps, like as survivors, like ask yourself if you're thinking of it as like a literal thing. Because if you're thinking of it as like, oh, I'm about to step into something like scary, or have things like that make it feel like there was like an earthquake in the system, like, and that there was like, it's like everything was like my whole world was about to like shake apart. Like there a lot of times it's like big overwhelming sensations. That one was like created by being like raped while being blindfolded, and then you also had like ear covers and stuff. So essentially you had like all your sensation was just like 100% just being like violently raped, but you didn't have like a lot of other sensations to go with it. And then they essentially kind of like instruct that part, that they're like an earthquake, and that anytime certain shit gets brought up, that this is like the essentially. And for that one, it was like if there was fuckery, it's either discovery of like the physical structure of like the system that they created, that they modeled my parts on. If there was an attempt of me to see it or to modify it, basically, because that came a lot later on in healing, that there would be like this sensation that I was shaking the foundations of my whole universe, and that I could not go any further, because if I did, so a lot of it's really overwhelming sensations and stuff. So that's the main thing to just come back to, is that like when we're talking about booby traps or stuff, we're not talking about like literal physical things that are going to go off inside you and create a chain of events that you will have no control over. That's not the case, even a little bit. It's always going to be a like little traumatized part of yourself that feels like they have to be putting you through whatever the booby trap is, to essentially punish you for stepping into an area in your healing or in your life that you're not supposed to, So I had mentioned the first time the cutting, that was a good example, where like, my main handler had essentially convinced a part, that we needed to cut ourselves anytime that we had been sexual with anyone that was not cult related or not sanctioned by our handler, essentially. So like when I was out partying in college and being very promiscuous, like the next morning I would end up, or sometimes there were the morning after I had been with him, and he essentially just wanted to like reinforce some other programming, it would, the next morning there would just be the insatiable urge for me to cut myself, and then I would do it. And then once I was done, I felt fine, which is most people's experience with cutting in general, is that you just, you do it when, you have emotional overwhelm and stuff. But for my therapist, they were like, I don't understand why it's starting now. It's always like a childhood thing, or it's a teenage thing. But that's what people don't understand, is like, until my college days, it's like I was the perfect kid. I was like totally unlocked, straight A student, no negative emotions, never got grounded, no nothing. Like to everyone I was the perfect child, but it's because you're fucking afraid, like I didn't get to be like who I wanted to be. I had to be who I had to be, and that's was my experience.
Well, that's even enlightening in itself, because I think that's the other thing. We have such a skewed way of considering what abuse could look like, not just considering what an abuser looks like, but what somebody who is being abused looks like. Yeah. People wouldn't expect that maybe the straight A valedictorian, perfect, star of the football team child that's like standing in front of them, on graduation night saying a speech could have gone through everything that you did. But I find more and more of the cases that's exactly the person, the archetype person that is going through this a lot of the times at these high levels, because again, like you are very smart, like higher than average IQ, like higher than average athletic capabilities, like that ability to perform well. And just
I don't know about the athletic thing. I still think that's something that that it, even in my hunting stuff, it wasn't something that was pushed too much, but it was more, so there's different stuff, like I had mentioned, like even the weapon skills, like my stuff is still pretty rudimentary, because there was always this like understanding that like you're gonna like once you're really needed, that they're gonna just pick you up and finish off the training that they need. So you have like updates to training and stuff like that, like throughout your life, but so yeah, so that's all I would say. I've never been, but to be honest, like, so that in my experience, if we wanted to piggyback this on booby traps, is my experience of like shutdown kind of stuff. So essentially, like, because, they didn't want me to be sexual, like they didn't want me to be violent, that it's like when I would start, my behaviors would start veering into those directions, essentially, like it's like there would be a lot of punishment, a lot of booby traps, for example. So I started having exercise induced asthma during my middle school time, because I had started sparring in my Taekwondo class, basically. So like I was great at like katas and doing all that kind of stuff, but as soon as it was like the physical hand-to-hand stuff, even though I had been trained in all of this stuff, like for years, like prior, when it came to all the like NWO soldier wolf training type stuff, like that, it's like that it was known, for my system, that's like the sex, not being sexual with someone I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't supposed to be violent or physically capable. I was a total bookworm, inside painting all day, never felt comfortable in my body. I was not supposed to feel comfortable in my body, and feel capable, and that's like, and that's something that I experience, is like when I was in the position of sparring and all of a sudden the adrenaline hit, it was almost like I had experienced a lot of like shutdown type booby traps, where I would start having, exercise induced asthma. They said, like basically where to me, it feels very similar to panic attacks too. You just can't breathe, like, and you feel like, like you have no energy and like all that stuff. And that's a lot of also what I experienced feeling. When I was dealing with those memories coming up again, I dealt with that same thing over again, of being like, oh my God, like, do I have asthma? And then investigating with that part and being like, oh, okay, like, no, this is like essentially like me, us tapping into the part of ourselves, like learning about, like the violent part of ourselves that had wanted to, to share and heal and everything, but it still comes along with, you know, with more awareness, but still comes along with all those same shutdown kind of feelings. So dealing with like waves of heavy fatigue and not having any energy, or like I said, I was gonna say like random body aches, you know, just like all your joints, or the sorry, the first thing I mentioned. Yeah, regardless, it's like you'll like the breathing kind of thing, the shortness of breath. It's like you'll experience, you know, those kinds of things. But that, like I was saying, like I constantly come back to like not giving it that much power, you know, like not really thinking like, oh my God, I'm gonna stop breathing, you know, and just recognizing that like this is something, you know, it goes a long way to realize that it's something psychosomatic, or like journal about it or something. And like, because sometimes we will have more control over as survivors over stuff like that than we realize, like once we investigate it.
Yes, that was a great answer. And I mean, it's really phenomenal, like what our bodies are capable of doing unconsciously, you know, and not that every child that has asthma is, you know, programmed, but like that doesn't come up in conversations at all. People don't
No.
consider in any case, and it doesn't have to just be programmed. I'm sure like something like asthma can be onset from, you know, other types of, you know, trauma too,
Oh
potentially,
yeah, for sure.
you know, but
Yeah.
it's like we don't take that
Well,
into
I know the placebo effect. Like it's the, you know, it's pretty much like it's using your body's ability for the placebo effect, but it's like weaponizing it essentially.
Yes, 100%. So this, I don't know, to me, it makes me have more empathy, and it makes me ask more questions about stuff instead of just accepting that somebody's sick or, you know, has an illness. I mean, it's so common with survivors that they have different brain body injuries that they deal with chronically throughout their life. And some of it starts to dissipate when they start to heal those areas, if you know, that's possible for that injury, you know, but it's like we're not taught that chronic pain or inflammation in our body, or just dysfunction or disease, could be related to trauma. We're always associated that it has to be something physical that we feel on our body, you know, and it's like that book, The Body Keeps the Score. It really does, you know, like our body remembers trauma, you know. And I love that you say like internal investigation, because I think like if more of us did that and looked in and said like, why do I have pain here? Why does this injury always seem to reoccur? Or like, why do I have this sore spot on my body? Or why do I have, you know, asthma attacks once in a while? Whatever it is, I would guarantee that a lot of things that manifest in our body over time do have some type of relation to some type of a negative emotion also, you know. And
Yeah.
I think survivors really do bring that to light and shine a light on that aspect, because I mean it's totally erased if it was ever taught anyways in, you know, in medicine, especially here in America.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think there's a very like, you know, I mean, and medicine is even getting more and more like proving it more and more, the mind body connection, you know. And that's a lot of like when I mentioned satanic panic before, like that's why like all of this stuff we're talking about has been suppressed like intentionally, you know, like the study of dissociation and trauma and its effects, you know, like everyone knew all of that shit since like World War II, and like the Nazis like essentially like standardized like abuse and studying it essentially, you know. So really, you know, it's been known for so long by like the enemy, eventually by the people that use it against us. And it's frustrating because whenever it's like stuff starts coming to light in like the general public, they just make it seem like it's bullshit. But in general, that's why I'm like really optimistic now, is because it is true. Just like scholarly articles that you can find on the effects of trauma or stuff, dissociation, all that stuff, you know, like I said, you know, false memory syndrome foundation is like not in the DSM-5, but dissociation is, you know. So it's something that, you know, little by little, you know, they're trying to put their spin on people becoming aware of stuff by kind of glorifying the Stranger Things aspect of things, you know, or like you know, making it seem like cool to be like a fucking super soldier or something, as if like you didn't go through things like I talked about like earlier in this episode, you know, which is like, you know, like there's no level of like, you know, like cool, I can use a gun or knife skills that would be worth, you know, going through shit like that or witnessing shit like that, you know, and but that's how it's presented right now, you know, in popular culture, is that rituals are just like a fun thing people do where you get to dress up, you know, and like, and, you know, and, you know, Stranger Things or other things that are all that, you know, trauma-based program soldiers, you know, are just like cool, you know, like, yeah, it sucks like what she went through, but how cool would it be to have those abilities, you know, and it's like, uh
Yes.
like, you listen to my episodes and then tell me that you would go through that just to feel like you could fucking like throw someone against the wall with your mind, you know, like 99% of the time that's not what you get. You get, you know, skills that they give you for their ends, you know, like, and not things that you would have chosen to want to do if like you had a choice in it, you know. It's not like, yay, I gotta go be like, you know, they didn't like program me to be the best mural artist in the world, you know, like.
Right. Yes. 100%. Yes. And somebody actually asked a question that what you just said reminded me of. Somebody had asked, any helpful aspects, basically, are there any aspects of your programming that serve you well?
So I don't know. So we'll say yes. We'll say yes and no. In general, like, anyone's going to be a better version of themselves without the programming. Like, just like, period, end of story. Like, because all the like quote unquote skills or things that you might have that like the normal person doesn't came at like a huge cost to where you can't really like use it like a normal person would, you know? So it's like, so so basically, like, I would say, you know, like, at this point, at a place like, so when I'm in AA, I say I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic, because I recognize that, like, that, you know, being an alcoholic was what got me into the rooms of AA. And then once I did that, it kind of started the process of me like liking myself and healing in general, like pre dealing with like the trauma stuff, you know? So there's a level of gratitude for like the struggles that we go through. And so there is a little bit of that, is that no, I would have not liked to have gone through any of this even a little bit, but I did go through it. And now that I'm in this position, there is a lot of ways where dissociation is incredibly helpful to me. And once you have some control over it, like, has created things in my life that to other people are very mind blowing, that to me are like not that big of a deal, you know, because there's a level, like, on certain parts, there's a level of confidence or something that, like, you know, to try new things essentially, you know, or different stuff. So, you know, like right now, if I was talking about the weapon stuff, like, seeing as like I might, you know, at some point like face some bodily harm or something, like, then yeah, like I am, you know, like, fuck my abuser, you know, fuck Schmiegel, you know, and fuck all of them. But, you know, now that I'm healing from stuff, like, am I going to be grateful that I know how to use a knife? Yes. You know, I'm going to be incredibly grateful about that, you know, because like, it was like the quote you gave, you know, that it's like, if I need to defend myself or my family, I feel a lot more confident to be able to do that now. And I like that. I like feeling comfortable in my body and able to, like, you know, handle myself in a situation versus feeling like afraid, you know. So that is one way, you know, that it's that those kind of things are beneficial. Or just like I said, like with the confidence, for example, you know, like the handler part of me that I ended up, you know, working with very early on, that was a persecutor part, you know, has had this way of treating me, you know, when it came to all my achievements, like my dad, essentially. So would, like, I felt like I wasn't okay with myself unless I was achieving something, unless I was doing something like that was, you know, that like, you know, I could look at if they're painting, like, whatever, you know, like, you know, that like would make me feel like, okay, like they have some self-worth, you know. But then also that's how I learned to deal with my abusers, was to go above and beyond, you know, that it's like, you know, because I learned that if I showed a certain skill, if you showed any less of that skill, you were going to get in trouble. So the best thing you could do is just to continually improve. And then it's like you could stay ahead of the game, essentially, just always be praised and never have to deal with the abuse side of things, you know? So like, for example, when I got started in my muraling, even for myself, that was a total mind fuck, to feel like I was like this level of confidence that I was going to be able to get on a boom lift, you know, and fucking paint a 40-foot tall water tower, you know? but like on a certain level, or even like this, being able to talk on a podcast, it's because I have a part that's very okay, with being what's the word, the public part, like I talked about, is very okay with being in front of people, with doing what we call the tap dance, like quote unquote, like where it's just like, hey, look how precocious and interesting I am, and like and just kind of like, being just kind of like bubbly and just, just whatever, and feeling like confident to just like address you and thousands of other people, like if it was just like the main me, and I didn't have that access to that part as well at all, which I didn't when I was pregnant. So the one interview I did while I was pregnant was incredibly difficult, because it's like, it felt, I had all the anxiety, I had all that, like, it was difficult. Most of the time I can be in AA, I can be like this, and I can talk and not have a lot of fear. And I get that from that confidence from that part, and the the other one with the boom lift, like I said, it's like, because he treated me like my dad. He was pretty much like, you can do anything, like, and it was just like, yeah, I fucking figure it out type of thing. So I went through the whole process with the city and other artists, to give them the design and do all this stuff, and then show up on the day of at the work site. And I'm just like, holy shit, I have this giant piece of machinery, this like crazy stuff that I have to like drive around and not damage, because it's fucking like millions of dollars. I'm sure it's all like city water equipment and stuff to get to this like thing. And then I'm going to be 40 feet up in the air, like painting this like mural, and it was like, for a lot of people, like that was just, or doing live painting like I've done on stage at tattoo conventions. For a lot of people, that's like completely mind blowing, And for me, because it's like, there's a part that feels like that's their job, that's what they were meant for, like even the part that was confident was just like, yeah, we'll figure it out, and had no issue, just figuring it out like with the boom lift. And then the part, that was painting could switch in like once we were actually up there, like, but it takes a lot of teamwork and everything, between the parts. So like I mentioned the metaphor in the first one, when it comes to dissociation, when it comes to good things about programming, it only comes from like from your own healing and your own integration. I really think, because you get to the point where it's like it's like a symphony, and you have all the instruments playing at different times, and it's like total chaos is what your life feels like. And then as you get some system understanding and you deal with your trauma therapy and everything, and you increase internal communication, what you'll experience is, all of those parts of yourself, playing when like instruments playing when they're supposed to, and it'll create like a beautiful symphony. And you'll have a part come in here, and then another one come in here, and like by all of them working together, they're all completely different instruments. That sounds shitty if they're playing, randomly, but if everything works together, it creates something really beautiful. And that's always the goal for me in my life. My goal is not integration and being like, like, oh, there's like one person, one personality in here. Because ultimately, like with my understanding of D.I.D, I was never given the chance to have one person, one personality. It's like the abuse started so early. So it's more about reconnecting with all those pieces that you lost, and just creating, the version of yourself that, all of you can be happy with.
That was a great explanation of that. Thank you. I love that people are so like, they're asking such sophisticated questions,
I know, that's why I was like, wow, people are great questions. Holy crap.
I love it. Let me see if there was anything else that I had sent about healing specifically. Some of it you had already covered that people had asked.
And hopefully my channel too is primarily going to be focused on that, like just kind of breaking down different healing tips, because it's a very overwhelming process. So I feel like having like little concrete exercises to do when it comes to journaling or stuff like that goes a long way to like kind of like, like trying to think of what to do when you're in trauma brain is like, so it helps to just be like, all right, do this right now and see if it helps,
Yes, and then hearing it from somebody that's like so level-headed like you, and hearing it like from a clinical perspective that's not like so emotionally charged, like how it probably feels, is very relieving too. It's like working out a math problem almost. Like you can be a bit more logical about it instead of getting so stuck in, what you're feeling. You can say, okay, well, what are the steps that I can take? What are my tools? how do I navigate this? And then to just have that realization that the more work you put into it, it does go from being this beginning orchestration of people brand new to playing an instrument, and they all sound kind of quirky and don't know how to work together. But the more you practice, like you said, you have this beautiful symphony at the end, and it's worth all that work that you put into it. So that's also inspiring to see like what's on the other side of putting that work in, because I'm sure it's so daunting to even think about how the hell do I how do I make all this work, and you're such a living testament to that. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And then I wanted to ask too, this is a subject change, not on healing, but this is actually a good question. We've heard multiple times like where they get children for sacrifice. And somebody had asked about animals, saying that not knowing where they get animals for sacrifices has casted a doubt on their own memories. So I don't know if you know that, or if you could speak on it, but that would be maybe a good question to answer too, since animals don't get talked about enough, but they're in a lot of these scenarios.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say to someone, if they're doubting their memories because of something logistical like that, I wouldn't. Basically, too much, just because like you're, especially if you're dealing with memories, like until you're pretty far along in healing and have most of your gaps filled in, there are going to be a lot of things that are going to like not make a lot of sense that will make sense later, so when I was first dealing with all the incest and trafficking memories, having memories in the kennel for me was just like, it felt like too crazy to be real, like I was just like really, that's something that they would treat me like a dog and drug me up and do bestiality and put me in a cage. It sounds so insanely foreign, to your experience even as like a front person, because you've been so dissociated from your memories and clinical. I'll say real quick, I'm good at doing the clinical thing. My therapists have called it like engineer brain. I just am like, I like breaking things down into its parts. But the thing is like I was incredibly dissociated from my emotions. Like I did not understand them, what the feeling of anger, how to recognize it, like sadness, I was all of it, was insanely dissociated from me until I started my trauma therapy like 7 years ago. So for me, my entry into healing has essentially been through having to learn how to break emotions down, like into like a more like physical, biological understanding of things, so that, because if you're a survivor, you're going to have trouble understanding emotions or dealing with emotions, so that's also why I try and stick in that area. Sorry to go off on a tangent, real quick. But so one thing I would say, with the memories, of like being like, they've sacrificed a bunch of animals, where could they get them from? Or like maybe they're a weird kind of animal or something like that. Like that, I feel like I wouldn't obsess over little things like that in my healing. Because the answer will probably be filled in at some point in the future. You should just deal with the things that are creating the emotional upset, and if in those memories that you're dealing with, it's about animals, regardless of what animals or whatever else, like you just have to, like, that's what I was saying, no judgment. You just have to listen to that part and what they're sharing, even if you don't understand it or have context for it, because you probably will understand it, have context later. So what I would say is you'll probably end up getting context for like where these animals came from. For me personally, it was because of the kennel memory. Like it was essentially like kind of like a more long-term boarding facility / vet's office in a more rural area of Texas, so they had a lot of land, they had a lot of different animals, and they essentially would it wasn't weird for them to be there, essentially, so. And the thing is like you're going to have like so some of the animals are just going to come from litters there, for me, like, so for kittens or things like that, but you're like, if you're dealing with like more like weird things, or farm things or different stuff, like you have to understand, if you're dealing with psychopaths, like they network and they're in every sector of society, so like they're not, it's, in my experience, you'll have dentists, doctors, military, police officers, and the thing, they're common like their title doesn't really matter. The common thing that they like, the reason they network with each other is because they share victims, so, and because they have the same interest in harming people or animals or something, so really if I wouldn't know like with someone's particular circumstance, but like if someone has a fetish for killing a specific animal, they're going to find a connection to get access to it. It's not more difficult than getting access to a kid, we're talking about an animal, so really, like realistically, like you're there, if there's like a specific fetish of someone for certain animals or different things, or whatever, like they're going to find a way to access it, like or it's going to be a convenience thing too. Maybe they just have like a friend who has like extra XYZ on hand and that becomes their, that's like their new victim, who knows, but that's the thing I would just say is that the animals, if they can get people, if they can get kids for this kind of thing, like getting the animals is really not going to be difficult. There's in my experience, pedophiles are never isolated. They're always networking. They're always, like essentially, looking for others like them so that they can, expand their access to other victims and stuff. So, I mean, and they just enjoy, being able to talk about the shit they like with someone else. So, yeah, like animals, yeah, like people, yeah, it's a lot of stuff for sure.
Yes. And you think about like, with humans, there's the channels of, obviously you could just straight up kidnap somebody, but realistically there's breeding programs, there's CPS, like there's lots of ways that
for Mexico, in like a lot of mine was my experience, was that like you were going to be dealing with like maybe like a lot of my experience was was like Mexican kids basically, because it was in Texas, I was in Arizona and everything. So you're going to have people that are coyotes, that are trafficking people across the border like that, like that, you're going to have like an easy supply, of stuff. So, and in my experience, those, like, I would say, like one of them was probably like a baby farm in my experience, or maybe just like a neglected kid, that had gotten sold, by a parent. But, the kids that for the hunting memory that I had talked about, like they were all like, and I think this was intentional, they were all like very like they had just been kidnapped, so they were kids that hadn't been traumatized, that were in, pajamas or different stuff like that. But I think a lot of that was intentional, because it's like, like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like, you kind of don't want kids that are going to dissociate, it's like you want kids that are going to act like afraid and like put up a fight and stuff like that, so there's different uses of, really victims, like you're saying, it's like animals, people, it's like, it's not just like the incident they put you through, for the programming. It's also who they decide, needs to fit the bill for the victim, as well.
Absolutely. And so many of those ways can transfer over to pets, like there's breeders of animals. So if somebody had, an affinity or a fetish for, say, Rottweilers, for example, like you could go to a breeder, or you could ask a dog breeders to call you whenever that dog gets turned in, like
exactly.
There's definitely so many ways that people can have access to things. So thank you for that. That was an interesting question. So I appreciate you answering that.
Of
Is
course.
that you wanted to cover tonight, or anything else that you had on your list to cover? I think we got through most of the questions, and you had answered some of them already.
Yeah, I know I answered a decent amount of them just by our chatting and everything. I really think, I mean, for me, I feel like this is a great time to stop. The only thing that like I hadn't really touched on, that someone had mentioned was maybe, like going into a little bit more detail on a couple of the more occult style rituals, and that is something I'm willing to do, like if you ever want to have me on in the future, just because it with everything else we had talked about today, it did feel like it was going to be like a whole nother whole nother box to open up, so and I'm long-winded, I'm sure this is going to be another long one, so thank you, again, for just giving me the platform to share and to just be really open about my experience, and to feel like I can do something for the victims that haven't been able to have a say and everything, and I just hope that that this will continue to contribute to your podcast and our common goal of creating awareness around child trafficking and ritual abuse, and snuff pornography and all the horrible things that still go on in this world that need to not anymore. So thank you, Emma.
Well,
it's been very healing.
Oh my gosh, this is some of the hardest stuff to talk about, and I want people to understand how much it took for you to get up and share all of that. I still feel like I could cry. I'm sure you feel very emotional too. It's really heavy stuff that we're talking about here, and it's real. So I'm so grateful that you're bringing attention to this, because not that going into detail is always necessary to understand that there's bad things, but I think it just hits people differently to be able to have the empathy how you provided with seeing a photo and imagining what that child went through, and I think when people can start to regain back their empathy, that's when we start to make strides to we're so disconnected from that as a society, and these stories always bring me back to that in my core, and keep me connected to that, and out of the the fear propaganda that I see so many other people in, I'd rather be in the space of this love and healing energy, as hard as it is to experience. I'd rather be on this side than hating people and in this fear mindset, so I appreciate the healing element that you bring to these conversations, and for your vulnerability and for your courage to share some of the hardest things that, to listen to experience, to even comprehend. I appreciate you coming on here and sharing with people, because I know the last time, so many people got incredible value out of it, and I think they're going to be just as touched this time, so thank you, Carrie, for coming on. It means the world to me.
Well, thank you again, Emma, for having your podcast, and it's been great healing for me, and now it just feels like it is on a whole nother level, so thank you. You're doing God's work, and I really appreciate all the work that you put in. I hope people understand how much work you really do, on your own time, just to kind of to help us all out.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Carrie. You make it easy. And where can people find you? You just started a YouTube channel, so I want you to give the name of that so people can go follow you, and then your Instagram also, and I'll link those in the show notes.
Yeah. So my Instagram, and it's like a professional page. So if you want to get through to me on there, it would actually be best if you shoot me an email, which is on there. But the Instagram is coverup_Carrie, CARRIE, because I am I specialize in cover-up tattoos. And then the title of the YouTube videos, which I haven't put on yet, is Desert Bikini, but you can just search, I don't know what the @ is, I think. So if you wouldn't mind just linking it, I'm not great with all the internet stuff.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. You had talked about doing it last time, and then you did it right after. So now you guys can follow Carrie on YouTube, and she's going to start her own channel putting out content, which is really exciting. And I can't wait to see what you create with that. So you guys go follow Carrie. I'm going to link all of her stuff below. Please share this however you can, whether it's just to one person, whether it's posting it to a channel, sharing it with a friend. We need to get the word out on this, and we need people to get the awareness, and we need people to care. We need people to take action. We need more people to speak up. We need more resources. There's so many reasons why we need to get these stories out, and I always say these platforms are not going to propagate or boost these up in the algorithm. We really need your help. You guys are the boots on the ground helping get this information out. We're here telling you, but you guys are the help. You guys are the ones that take the envelope and, deliver the mail to other people. So please help us in doing this, and share Carrie's story far and wide. And thank you guys so much for listening and for tuning in, and for just holding space for these really hard conversations, and for sitting through it with us. I know this was a really emotional episode, and I appreciate the people that are still here right now listening to us talk. So thank you guys for caring enough to listen to Carrie's story and to just hang in here with us and understand these really hard things that are very real. So you guys go connect with us. I have all of my information also in the show notes. So follow us on social media, share, comment, boost her up, go follow Carrie, go hype her, go tell her how loved she is and amazing. And as always, you guys, God bless you, and we will see you next week.